It's strange how quickly we got used to the idea of space travel. Today, it feels normal that machines circle above us, that astronauts live on a station that never stops orbiting, and that nations talk openly about going back to the moon or even heading to Mars. But it wasn't long ago that none of this felt normal at all. There was a time when sending anything into space seemed almost impossible. And even when it did happen, the world wasn't sure how to react. People felt excited, proud, and also a little scared. Because the truth is, the story of how we first reached space is not just a story about science. It's a story about fear, competition, and the strange way human beings push forward when they're worried someone else might get there first. To understand that, you have to look at the two countries that made the first moves. On one side was the United States. On the other was the Soviet Union, often called Soviet Russia at the time. These were the two great superpowers after the Second World War, and they did not trust each other. They had different political systems, different ideas of freedom, and very different visions of what the future should look like. And both of them knew that whoever controlled the newest technologies would shape that future. So the race to space wasn't a friendly contest. It was part of a much larger struggle between two nations trying to prove their strength. Rockets were tied to missiles. Satellites were tied to surveillance. And every success in orbit felt like a signal that one side might be pulling ahead. For ordinary people watching from below, it was exciting and unsettling at the same time. A small metal object beeping across the sky might not seem dangerous on its own, but what it represented absolutely did. And yet, out of that tension came something extraordinary. Because this rivalry, which started with fear and suspicion, eventually pushed humans further than anyone expected. Step by step, launch by launch, it led to one of the most famous moments in history: human beings walking on the moon. Not because the world had agreed on some shared dream of exploration, but because two nations refused to let the other one get there first. So tonight, we're going to trace how that happened. How a struggle between two superpowers ended up creating a new era of science and engineering. How it shaped the politics of the entire 20th century. And how, through all the pressure and competition, it still managed to produce moments of real wonder. This is the Moonlight Scholar, a place for quiet stories of science, history, and the mysterious corners in between. I hope you will find rest here, and maybe even learn something. If you fall asleep along the way, you can always return later. There are timestamps in the description below, so you can easily find your way back to the story. If you enjoy this video, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and tap the like button. It helps more people discover these quiet stories, and you might just help another sleepless person drift off a bit easier. Before we begin our story tonight, I would like you to take a moment to settle down and let go of the day. You can start by finding a comfortable position, sitting or lying down, whatever feels right for you. Let your shoulders drop a little. Maybe loosen your jaw if it's been clenched without you noticing. There's no goal here, no perfect way to do this. Just let your body shift into something softer. Take a slow breath in and let it fall out again. Nothing dramatic. Just a normal breath, but a little more deliberate than usual. And one more like that. In and out. If your mind is still busy, that's completely fine. You don't need to force it quiet. Just give it permission to slow down at its own pace. For the next little while, all you need to do is listen. And now, when you're ready, we can begin our story. It's worth pausing on a simple question before we get too deep into the race towards the sky. Why go to space at all? Because if you look at the world right after the Second World War, space exploration seems like the last thing anyone should have cared about. Most countries were rebuilding cities that had been bombed to rubble. Millions of families were displaced. Economies were exhausted. You would think the great powers, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, who emerged as the most influential nations on Earth, would have focused entirely on repairing the damage. But instead, both of them poured staggering amounts of money and talent into rockets. And these rockets weren't carrying experiments or telescopes. They were built to deliver nuclear weapons across continents. Their purpose was destructive long before it was scientific. It creates a strange contradiction when you look back at it. On one hand, people talk about the early space age as this bright era of exploration, a time when humanity looked upward with curiosity. But the truth underneath is much sharper. At the beginning, rockets weren't symbols of hope. They were symbols of fear. Both superpowers felt it. The United States didn't want to fall behind technologically, especially after seeing how dangerous German V-2 rockets had been during the war. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin and later Nikita Khrushchev, felt cornered by American military power and believed that long-range missiles were the only way to stay secure. So even though each side claimed to be defending peace, both kept escalating. One new missile test pushed the other to respond. One rumor of progress created panic across an ocean. And this is where the tension begins, this uncomfortable mix of curiosity, national pride, and quiet dread. Because when you strip away the mythology, the early steps into space didn't start with star charts or dreams of reaching other worlds. They started with two nations trying to outdo each other at the edge of what technology could handle. The odd thing is, for most ordinary people in the 1950s, space wasn't even a place yet. It was an idea. A blank region above the sky, mostly imagined through science fiction. So when governments started talking about rockets that could leave the atmosphere, it didn't feel like exploration. It felt like escalation. If someone could send a machine into space, they could send a weapon anywhere. And yet, that's the tension that makes this story so compelling. The same technology built in fear would eventually lead humans to the moon. The same rivalry that could have ended the world ended up pushing us off the world instead. To see why, we need to step into the years right before Sputnik, the early to mid-1950s, roughly 1950 to 1957, a period when everything in global politics felt stretched thin, like the surface tension on a drop of water. The United States and the Soviet Union had settled into what everyone called the Cold War. The name made it sound distant, but it wasn't. It shaped everyday life. There was espionage, military build-ups, and a sense that the world had been neatly cut in two. Capitalism on one side, communism on the other. Each country watched the other closely, trying to track every technological advance and political move. This tension fed into something even more unsettling: nuclear weapons. Both nations were creating bombs far stronger than anything dropped on Japan. And there was real anxiety coming from the competition over how to deliver them. Airplanes were already fast, but they still had to cross oceans. Rockets, on the other hand, could arc over continents in minutes. That made ballistic missile research a top priority. And this is where the lines between warfare and space exploration began to blur. A rocket designed to carry a nuclear warhead didn't look very different from a rocket that could launch a satellite. Engineers working on missile guidance systems were, often unintentionally, also solving problems that would later make spaceflight possible. The distinction between military project and scientific progress wasn't clean. It was the same hardware, the same fuel tanks, the same math. People at the time understood this, at least at a gut level. Newspapers might not have spelled out the engineering, but they didn't need to. The Cold War had created a mindset where any advance in the sky translated into power on the ground. If one country could send something higher and faster, it wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a warning. And this shaped how the world thought about space long before anyone got there. Today we're used to imagining space as a place of exploration, or science, or maybe even adventure. But back then, space wasn't neutral territory. It was an extension of the battlefield. Whoever reached it first wouldn't just get bragging rights. They would get the high ground, the literal high ground, in a world terrified of being caught off guard. In the race towards the stars, the USSR got a head start. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched a satellite called Sputnik. It was small, 58 centimeters across, roughly the size of a beach ball. It weighed a little under 85 kilos, or 185 pounds, about the weight of a large adult. Inside, it had a simple radio transmitter that emitted a steady beep, beep, beep as it circled the Earth. That was it. No cameras, no experiments, no living passengers. Just a metal sphere in orbit. And yet, the satellite caused a global shock. In the United States, the reaction was immediate. For decades, Americans had considered their country the land of innovation. They had developed jet engines, early computers, atomic bombs, and advanced radar systems. They had broken speed records in airplanes and led in aeronautical engineering. Then came Sputnik. A tiny, simple sphere orbiting the Earth made it clear. The Soviets had beaten the US into space. And because the same rockets that launched satellites could carry nuclear warheads, Americans worried that their cities could be struck without warning. It wasn't only pride at stake. There was fear. Schools across the country were filled with anxious children learning to duck and cover. Families imagined missiles falling from the sky. Newspapers ran headlines like "Red Satellite Circles Earth" and "US Trails in Space Race." Radio programs replayed the beeps of Sputnik over and over, each ping a reminder that the Cold War had reached a new dimension. The technical simplicity of Sputnik made the reaction all the more striking. It had no onboard camera, no scientific experiments, and no maneuvering system. Its orbit was elliptical, taking about 96 minutes to circle the Earth. The batteries powering the transmitters lasted 21 days, enough for the beeps to be picked up by amateur radio operators around the world. The satellite functioned perfectly, proving that the Soviets had mastered the core technology needed for spaceflight. The launch also revealed how far Soviet missile technology had come. Sputnik was carried into orbit by an R-7 rocket, a massive vehicle originally designed as a long-range intercontinental missile. Over 30 meters tall, burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, it had enough thrust to lift the satellite into orbit. For the US, still struggling with smaller, less reliable rockets, the R-7 was a demonstration of capability they could not ignore. The political and military response in the US was immediate. Funding for missile and rocket research surged. Universities suddenly found themselves collaborating on top-secret projects. The Department of Defense coordinated closely with private companies, pooling engineering talent to improve guidance systems, propulsion, and materials. Within months, the National Defense Education Act was passed, injecting money into science and math education at every level, because the government recognized that long-term technological leadership depended on nurturing talent from childhood. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, NASA was quietly forming. Though it wouldn't officially exist until 1958, the agency was already being shaped as a civilian face for what had begun as a military effort. The government wanted to show the world that America could not only compete in space, but lead in a way that appeared peaceful and visionary. Across the ocean, the Soviets were satisfied. The satellite had done exactly what they wanted. It demonstrated that they could build and launch a rocket capable of placing objects in orbit, and by extension, capable of delivering warheads to distant targets. The launch was technically simple, but strategically effective. By the end of 1957, Sputnik had permanently shifted the space race. Funding increased, programs accelerated, and the United States began catching up in technology and strategy. The satellite itself was small and simple, but it was enough to set the pace for the next decade. As I mentioned, the space race wasn't just about rockets and satellites. Sending objects, and eventually humans, into space were not just engineering feats. It was one front in a much larger struggle, the Cold War, where every technological achievement, every political move, every cultural signal was freighted with meaning. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing not just for military advantage or scientific progress, but for the claim to be the better society. Who could create a system that produced more capable citizens, stronger economies, more advanced technology? Who could demonstrate that their ideology, their way of organizing people and resources, was superior? Space became an especially visible way to answer that question because it offered proof in the sky, achievements that the world could see and measure. In the Soviet Union, space was framed as proof of the strength of the state. The government wanted to show that centralized planning and strict control could achieve things that free societies could not. They were demonstrations of ideological power. Every success was presented as a victory of the socialist system itself. Cosmonauts, the Soviet term for astronauts, fit this narrative perfectly. They were carefully selected, rigorously trained, and publicly celebrated as heroes molded by the state. Yuri Gagarin, the first human in orbit, became a global symbol. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a living statement of what the Soviet system could produce. His image was everywhere, on posters, in newspapers, in newsreels, showing a smiling, capable figure who represented the collective success of the nation. The cosmonauts' personal lives, their training, even their very names were tightly controlled by the government. The United States took a different approach. Space was framed as a frontier, a new land to explore. It continued a story Americans had been telling themselves for centuries, from Lewis and Clark to the pioneers of the West, that exploration was an individual and national achievement. NASA, when it was founded in 1958, was presented as a civilian agency focused on science, discovery, and peaceful exploration. In reality, its work was deeply tied to military technology and strategy. The rockets and satellites it developed were dual use, capable of both exploration and warfare. But the public story was about adventure, progress, and American ingenuity. American astronauts were heroic too, but in a different way. They were trained for skill, endurance, and composure under pressure, and they were celebrated for their courage and individuality. They became symbols of the nation's ability to innovate, take risks, and conquer new challenges. The narrative emphasized human agency as much as technological prowess, that people, not just the state, were responsible for progress. In both countries, the stories shaped what was built. The Soviets focused on firsts: first satellite, first human, first woman in space, each a proof of the system's superiority. The Americans pursued both firsts and long-term programs like developing reusable spacecraft and lunar missions, but always under the banner of national pride and individual heroism. So by the early 1960s, the space race was more than rockets and satellites. It was a competition of ideas. Each country used space to tell the world and themselves who they were and who they believed they could be. Behind the groundbreaking achievements of the space race were not just two nations, but people, engineers, scientists, pilots, whose expertise, labor, and endurance turned ideas into hardware and missions into reality. And those people often carried extraordinary burdens, both moral and personal. On the American side, the most famous figure was Wernher von Braun. Before arriving in the United States, von Braun had been a lead engineer in Nazi Germany, heading the development of the V-2 rocket, one of the most destructive weapons of the Second World War. The V-2 was a technological marvel for its time. It could travel over 300 kilometers, carrying a warhead capable of leveling entire neighborhoods. But it was also built using forced labor. Thousands of prisoners in concentration camps were put to work under brutal conditions with high mortality rates. Von Braun's work was inseparable from this human cost. After the war, von Braun and many of his colleagues were brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, a program designed to recruit German scientists to support American military research. The US government prioritized his technical skill over ethical concerns. Von Braun quickly became central to America's missile and space programs. He oversaw the development of rockets such as the Redstone and Jupiter, which served both as weapons and as the first launch vehicles for satellites. Later, he designed the Saturn V, the enormous rocket that would take astronauts to the moon. Von Braun's public image, however, was carefully managed. The American government and media presented him as a brilliant visionary, the hero of the space program, while minimizing his Nazi past and the V-2 program's use of forced labor. Interviews, television appearances, and press releases emphasized his genius and dedication to peaceful exploration, effectively rebranding his wartime expertise. Behind the scenes, though, scientists and officials were well aware of the ethical compromises that had made his knowledge available. Von Braun's story is a reminder that technical skill, political necessity, and moral ambiguity were deeply intertwined in the early space race. In the Soviet Union, the central figure was Sergei Korolev. His life could not have been more different. In 1938, Korolev was arrested on suspicion of anti-Soviet activity and sent to a labor camp. He survived harsh conditions that killed many others, and later he was assigned to work on rocket research in a Sharashka, a secret design bureau run by imprisoned engineers. By the late 1940s, Korolev was released from prison and gradually rose to lead the Soviet space program. Korolev's genius was essential to every early Soviet achievement, from the first satellite launches to human spaceflight. But unlike von Braun, Korolev's identity was kept secret. The world did not know his name until after his death in 1966. He was referred to only as the chief designer. His anonymity reflected the Soviet approach. The state controlled the narrative, and even its most talented individuals were tools of the system rather than celebrated heroes. The secrecy also protected him politically. In a country where missteps could be fatal, staying in the shadows was a survival strategy. Korolev worked under constant pressure. Successes were celebrated as triumphs of the Soviet system. Failures could be catastrophic for careers and sometimes lives. Engineers were pushed to the limits of what was technically feasible, often with minimal testing by today's standards. When rockets exploded, investigations were conducted quietly, and the public rarely learned the full story. Every achievement was a combination of brilliance, risk, and state control. Meanwhile, the astronauts and cosmonauts operated under entirely different but equally intense pressures. Publicly, they were portrayed as nearly superhuman. They were models of courage, endurance, and composure under conditions that no ordinary person could withstand. But privately, they faced grueling training schedules, extended isolation, and constant scrutiny. NASA's Mercury and Gemini astronauts, for example, spent hours in centrifuges and isolation chambers, practiced emergency egress procedures in freezing water, and ran through endless simulations of possible in-flight failures. Cosmonauts faced similar programs with additional political oversight. Every detail of their personal lives, family, hobbies, even names, could be used to project an image consistent with state propaganda. Training accidents were common. Test pilots were killed or severely injured during high-speed runs and spacecraft tests. Long separations from family added emotional strain. Political pressure compounded physical danger. Astronauts and cosmonauts were representatives of their nation, symbols of ideology and technological capability. Success could make them global heroes. Failure could be catastrophic, personally and politically. The human story behind the space race was a mixture of talent, exploitation, and control. Engineers like von Braun and Korolev were central to every mission, yet their lives were shaped by political contexts and ethical compromises. The men and women who rode the rockets were celebrated as symbols, but their accomplishments depended on endurance, discipline, and often personal sacrifice. The race ran on both genius and exploitation, brilliance harnessed within systems that demanded conformity, obedience, and extraordinary performance under immense pressure. Beyond the individual stories, there was another layer of complexity. Programs were massive collaborations. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and support staff worked behind the scenes, often under extreme secrecy. For every astronaut in space, there were dozens of people running tests, designing components, and monitoring data. The public saw triumphs in orbit, but the vast machinery, human, technical, and political, that made those moments possible remained mostly hidden. In both the US and the USSR, success depended on balancing human skill with control. Mistakes could be fatal. Politics dictated priorities. Propaganda shaped the narrative. By understanding the people behind the rockets, the engineers and pilots, the ethical compromises, and the pressures they endured, we get a fuller picture of the space race. It wasn't only a contest of machines or ideology. It was a contest of people, and the achievements we celebrate were built on talent, endurance, and the careful management, sometimes ruthless, of those who made it happen. In the early years of the space age, most missions carried instruments, satellites, or simple scientific payloads. Rockets were tested for stability, guidance, and propulsion, and engineers learned how to place objects into orbit. But by the late 1950s, attention shifted toward humans. Sending a person into space was a very different challenge. Unlike a satellite, a human needs air, temperature control, protection from radiation, and a cabin that can survive launch and re-entry. The stakes were higher because failure didn't just mean a lost experiment. It meant risking a life. To prepare for this shift, both the Soviet Union and the United States turned to animals. Dogs, monkeys, and other creatures were sent on suborbital and orbital flights to understand how weightlessness, acceleration, and confinement affected living beings. In 1957, the Soviets launched the dog Laika aboard Sputnik 2. She became the first living creature to orbit Earth. She did not survive the mission, but her flight provided valuable data about how life reacted to the stresses of orbit. In the United States, monkeys and chimpanzees flew on Mercury test capsules, helping engineers refine life support, restraint systems, and cabin layouts. The experiments revealed how hearts, lungs, and nerves responded to extreme conditions, and they shaped the design of capsules for human passengers. With this foundation, engineers faced the challenge of sending an actual human into orbit. For Vostok 1, launched on April 12, 1961, the Soviets built a small, spherical capsule atop an R-7 rocket. Inside this capsule was Yuri Gagarin, the first person to enter outer space. The capsule had to maintain pressure, supply oxygen, remove carbon dioxide, and regulate temperature throughout launch, orbit, and re-entry. Gagarin could control very little himself. Nearly everything depended on automated systems. Any failure could have been fatal. Yuri Gagarin's training was intensive. He spent months in centrifuges to simulate launch forces, practiced emergency ejection procedures, and endured hours in isolation chambers to study the psychological effects of confinement. Engineers ran hundreds of unmanned Vostok flights with mannequins and dogs, each test providing crucial data on cabin systems, re-entry procedures, and physiological limits. The goal was to ensure that when a human was finally aboard, the spacecraft could carry them safely around the planet and back. Vostok 1 was a short flight, just over 108 minutes, completing a single orbit of Earth, but it carried enormous significance. Technically, it demonstrated that a human could survive weightlessness, endure acceleration forces, and safely re-enter the atmosphere. Politically, it sent a message. The Soviet Union had mastered human spaceflight first. The cosmonaut became a symbol of Soviet scientific achievement and the capability of centralized planning. The United States, which had been racing to catch up, intensified its own programs in response. In the United States, the challenges of human spaceflight were equally daunting, but Apollo 8 would raise the stakes even further. Launched on December 21, 1968, it was the first crewed mission to leave low Earth orbit and orbit the Moon. Unlike Vostok 1, which had launched 7 years earlier and lasted barely 2 hours, Apollo 8 required keeping 3 astronauts alive for 6 days in deep space, with no possibility of rescue if something went wrong. The spacecraft had to provide life support, navigation, and communication over hundreds of thousands of kilometers. The crew faced radiation exposure, microgravity effects on muscles and bones, and the psychological strain of complete isolation. Training for Apollo 8 was exhaustive. Astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders spent countless hours in simulators that replicated the entire mission: launch, lunar orbit insertion, and return. Emergency procedures, orbital maneuvers, and navigation protocols were practiced repeatedly. Mock-ups of the command module and lunar module were used in neutral buoyancy tanks to simulate microgravity. Even meals were carefully tested to ensure nutrition, digestibility, and storage over the mission's 6 days. Every system, oxygen tanks, fuel cells, navigation instruments, had to operate flawlessly. The technical complexity of Apollo 8 was immense. Unlike satellite launches, the spacecraft had to be precisely navigated to enter lunar orbit and return to Earth safely. A miscalculation could send it past the Moon or on a dangerous trajectory toward Earth. Re-entry involved extreme speeds, with the heat shield enduring temperatures far higher than any previous human mission. Every component, from life support to electrical systems, was tested and retested to minimize risk. Apollo 8 also had political significance. While the mission's focus was on human capability and technical mastery, orbiting the Moon before landing demonstrated to the world that the United States could operate in deep space. The mission underscored American technical leadership and offered a symbolic counterpoint to earlier Soviet firsts. One of the most striking outcomes of Apollo 8 was the photograph of Earth rising above the Moon's horizon, often called Earthrise. It was a simple image, a fragile blue and white sphere floating in black space. But it captured something that words alone could not. For the first time, people saw their planet as a whole, isolated in the vastness of space. Technically, It demonstrated the crew's ability to navigate lunar orbit and maintain stable photography. Symbolically, it shifted the perspective of humanity, reminding the world how small and interconnected everything below that horizon really was. Vostok 1 and Apollo 8 illustrate how human spaceflight differed from sending inanimate objects into orbit. A satellite could fail without harming anyone. Humans required fully functioning life support, carefully managed acceleration and re-entry, and comprehensive training. Risks were magnified, and every technical problem became a matter of life and death. Both programs relied on rigorous preparation, countless unmanned tests, and exhaustive astronaut and cosmonaut training. The human element extended beyond the individuals in the spacecraft. Every flight depended on teams of engineers, technicians, and administrators working behind the scenes. For every cosmonaut or astronaut, there were hundreds, even thousands of people monitoring systems, conducting tests, and refining procedures. The success of Vostok 1 and Apollo 8 was as much a reflection of this collective effort as it was of the crews themselves. Each mission pushed the boundary a little farther, from Gagarin's single orbit to Apollo 8's journey around the Moon, and by the end of the 1960s, the next step was unavoidable. All the incremental gains, all the trial runs and course corrections had been leading toward one goal: sending human beings to the surface of the Moon. It had become the defining prize of the space race, the moment that would settle, at least symbolically, who had mastered the new territory opened by the space age. By 1969, that expectation shaped everything. The moon landing was no longer just another milestone. It was the milestone, the one that had captured the public imagination and driven political promises. When Apollo 11 began its preparations, it did so under the weight of a decade of competition, billions of dollars of investment, and the sense, shared on both sides of the Iron Curtain, that this event would stand as the ultimate measure of national capability. By now, the United States had developed the rockets, spacecraft, and training protocols necessary to attempt what had once seemed impossible: landing humans on the Moon and returning them safely. But Apollo 11 was not just a technical challenge. It was a statement about national capability, human ambition, and the ideological stakes of the space race. The mission began on July 16, 1969, with the Saturn V rocket, the largest and most powerful launch vehicle ever built at the time. Towering over 110 meters, it carried the Apollo Command Module, where astronauts Michael Collins, Neil Armstrong, and Buzz Aldrin would live during the journey, and the Lunar Module, designed to separate and land on the Moon. Engineers had to solve unprecedented problems: how to control a 3-stage rocket, manage the immense thrust of liftoff, and ensure precise navigation over 384,000 kilometers of empty space. Every system, fuel, guidance, life support, and communications, had to operate perfectly. A single malfunction could end the mission, or worse. The Moon itself posed a unique challenge. Unlike orbiting Earth, Lunar landings required descending through an airless, gravitationally weaker environment, with terrain hazards that could not be fully mapped in advance. The lunar module had to be light enough to land safely, but robust enough to support astronauts and equipment. Armstrong's final descent involved manually piloting the module past boulders and craters, searching for a flat, safe landing zone. The technical accomplishment was extraordinary, but it was only part of the story. Politically, Apollo 11 carried enormous weight. By 1969, the Cold War was ongoing, and the Soviets had been first in orbit and first with a human in space. A successful moon landing would be a symbolic victory for the United States, demonstrating technological superiority and the ability to achieve national goals through ingenuity and coordination. The mission was framed in the media as both a scientific triumph and a cultural milestone, a way to inspire Americans during a time of domestic turbulence, civil rights struggles, the Vietnam War, and widespread social change. Culturally, the moon landing was unprecedented. Broadcast live on television to millions worldwide, the event created a shared global experience. People watched as Armstrong descended the ladder and stepped onto the lunar surface, uttering his famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The moment combined the immediacy of a live event with the historic weight of humanity reaching another world for the first time. For many, the image of astronauts on the moon transcended politics, symbolizing the potential for human achievement. Even so, the political undertones were never far away. Apollo 11 reinforced the narrative of American ingenuity and determination, but it also highlighted the military and strategic dimensions of space exploration. The same technologies that put men on the moon were derived from missile development programs, and the ability to coordinate such a complex, resource-intensive project demonstrated logistical and industrial superiority on a global stage. Every successful step, launch, orbit, insertion, lunar landing, and return, sent a message not only to the world, but specifically to the Soviet Union. The United States could undertake high-risk, high-reward projects that no other nation could match at the time. The mission was not without its human toll. Hours of confined space, the constant awareness of risk, and the physical strain of weightlessness challenged the crew daily. Communication delays meant they had to rely heavily on training and judgment rather than real-time guidance from mission control. The astronauts' work on the lunar surface, collecting rock samples, deploying scientific instruments, and photographing their surroundings, combined scientific purpose with symbolic gesture. Every movement was documented, every sample catalogued, but every action was also broadcast to a watching world eager for proof of success. The return to Earth on July 24, 1969, concluded the mission safely, but the impact extended far beyond the splashdown. Apollo 11 became a benchmark for what humanity could achieve when politics, technology, and human determination aligned. It inspired a generation of engineers, scientists, and ordinary people to believe that previously unimaginable goals were within reach, and it left an enduring image, Earth rising above the barren lunar landscape, fragile and singular, reminding everyone that even amidst rivalry, cooperation, and competition, there is only one planet for all of us. The space race is remembered for its firsts, its heroes, and its dramatic milestones. But behind the headlines, there were costs that rarely made it into newspapers or TV broadcasts. Every triumph carried trade-offs for science, for safety, and for the truth. Money and attention were some of the first things diverted. In both the United States and the Soviet Union, a huge share of resources went into the most visible programs: rockets, capsules, and eventually lunar landings. Billions of dollars flowed into a handful of prestige missions, leaving other research programs struggling for funding. In the US, early satellite projects, earth science studies, and experimental physics sometimes had to compete with Apollo and Mercury for engineers and materials. In the USSR, long-term scientific goals were often overshadowed by the need to score symbolic firsts. The focus on spectacle over science meant that progress was impressive, but not always balanced. Then there was safety. Early spaceflight was dangerous, and governments had to decide what the public could see. The Soviet Union experienced fatal test failures before sending humans into orbit. Rockets exploding on the pad, animals dying during experimental flights. Most of these incidents were never reported at the time. In the US, the Apollo 1 fire killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test. The story made headlines, but many of the design flaws and decisions that led to the accident weren't fully explained to the public until much later. Both nations had to manage the tension between public confidence and the real risks astronauts and cosmonauts faced every day. Propaganda shaped choices too. Some missions were timed or planned to make the biggest possible impression rather than for pure scientific gain. Gagarin's flight, for example, was carefully orchestrated to guarantee a Soviet victory in the headlines. Apollo 11's television coverage was edited and managed to show calm precision, even though the astronauts were under immense stress and mission control was solving problems in real time. These decisions boosted national prestige, but they sometimes came at the expense of deeper exploration or experimental goals. The connection to military technology added another layer. The rockets used for human spaceflight came from ballistic missile programs. Every improvement in propulsion, navigation, or materials could be applied to weapons as well as spacecraft. Engineers weren't just solving problems for exploration. They were building tools that could deliver bombs across continents. These hidden costs didn't erase the achievements of the space race, but they give a fuller picture of what it took to get humans into orbit and to the moon. Progress came at the expense of other research. Human lives were risked, information was carefully controlled, and technology was never purely scientific. The public saw heroes and firsts, but behind the headlines, the story was more complicated, a mix of innovation, risk, and competition that went far beyond what anyone could see on the news. The end of the space race didn't happen with a single announcement or a single decision. It was more like a slow drift, with a bunch of different pressures pulling both sides toward the same conclusion. The moon had been reached, and pushing further didn't make sense anymore. Money was a big part of it. The United States had spent billions of dollars on Apollo, rockets, spacecraft, training, mission control, everything. After Apollo 11, the follow-up missions were still impressive, but Congress and the public weren't as eager to keep spending at that scale. There were other priorities: the Vietnam War, civil rights, social programs, and space exploration, while inspiring, had to compete. The Soviets had limits of their own. Technical problems, especially with the N-1 rocket, slowed progress. Their lunar program was ambitious, but resources were finite. They couldn't keep up a full-scale moon program while also investing in military projects, industry, and domestic needs. By the late 1960s, it was clear that landing a human on the moon would require more than the Soviet economy could sustain. Public interest mattered too. Apollo 11 captured global attention, but as missions continued, the excitement started to fade. Television broadcasts became routine, headlines grew smaller, and fewer people followed the details. For governments, that mattered. A space program is expensive, and if the public isn't paying attention, it's harder to justify spending billions. The novelty of lunar exploration was wearing off, and politicians noticed. There was also the matter of risk. Every mission carried real danger, from launch to lunar landing to re-entry. The astronauts and cosmonauts were highly trained, but no amount of preparation could eliminate the possibility of disaster. As the missions continued, the combination of cost, risk, and decreasing public attention made continued lunar competition harder to defend. Strategically, both sides had already achieved the main goal: symbolic victory. The United States had landed humans on the moon, proving technological and organizational supremacy. The Soviet Union had been first in orbit and in many early milestones, but they recognized that catching up to a moon landing would require an enormous investment with uncertain payoff. At that point, continuing the race promised diminishing returns. So the space race didn't end with drama or failure. It ended because the costs, financial, technical, political, and human, were mounting. Both nations had proven they could reach the moon, and both understood that further competition wasn't worth the effort. The missions that followed were still remarkable, but the intense push that defined the 1960s was over. The race slowed, not because anyone gave up, but because the circumstances no longer demanded the extremes that had launched humans into space in the first place. When we look back at the space race today, it's easy to think of it as a story of clear winners and losers, a straight line of progress from Sputnik to the moon. The reality is messier. Both superpowers left behind achievements, mistakes, and lessons, some obvious, some subtle. The most visible inheritance is the technology. Satellites, rocket engines, guidance systems, and materials that were once cutting edge are now the foundation of everything from weather forecasting to GPS. Private companies launching rockets today stand on the shoulders of engineers who are racing not just for science, but for national prestige. In that sense, the space race left us with tools and knowledge we still rely on. But some of what we've inherited is more complicated. The narrative that the race was purely about exploration oversimplifies things. Fear, rivalry, and politics were central drivers. The innovation boom often cited was shaped as much by urgency and competition as by curiosity. Many programs outside the spotlight, especially scientific research not tied to firsts or milestones, were delayed or underfunded. What looks like progress on a timeline hides the trade-offs that made it possible. We also inherited a pattern in how we explore. Large-scale, expensive missions are often justified by symbolic goals rather than immediate scientific payoff. The pressure to achieve visible milestones can skew priorities. In the 1960s, that meant the moon landing. Today, it shapes how governments and private companies plan missions to Mars, the Moon again, or new orbital platforms. The same forces that drove Apollo, prestige, rivalry, national pride, are still part of the equation. Misunderstandings persist too. There's a tendency to think the United States won the race and the Soviet Union lost. In reality, the Soviets led in many early areas: first satellite, first human in orbit, and a series of technical achievements that still impress. The US caught up and surpassed them in the moon race, but the story isn't as simple as a single winner taking all. Similarly, we often underestimate how fragile these programs were, how much relied on extraordinary circumstances, political will, and enormous resources that couldn't easily be sustained. Finally, there's the human legacy. Engineers, scientists, cosmonauts, and astronauts all faced immense pressures. The accomplishments we celebrate were built on years of meticulous work, risk, and often personal sacrifice. The triumphs on paper obscure the daily realities: long hours, dangerous tests, secrecy, and the occasional failure that never made the news. The space race gave us more than rockets and satellites. It gave us a model for thinking about exploration, innovation, and ambition. It left a mixed legacy of achievement and compromise, progress and cost. And it reminds us that the stories we tell about history, even history as high profile as going to the moon, can be both illuminating and misleading, depending on what we choose to focus on. We have reached the end of our story tonight. Perhaps you are already asleep, my voice a faint echo in your dreams. Or perhaps you are still awake, ready for another journey from my library. Thank you for spending this time here. I hope I'll see you again soon. Until then, good night.